films.
Oh yeah, because it's not stop, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just get the doors open and all that stuff.
Yes.
I'll put your email about the keynote.
Ah, great.
There's actually, funny enough, there were some people who I did the workshop in Wales,
Okay.
60. And yeah, there's a couple of women that I'm going to meet with. So yeah, which would be quite interesting.
So you're going to do the commission? Well,
I wouldn't mind, yeah, I'll see what they think, because they're like, they just want to do it, but not quite sure whether they, yeah.
I'm just going to get us going, okay.
That's all right.
Yeah, but it would be interesting to work with, for me, anyway.
Hello to anybody out there in YouTube land. Welcome to the Ignite Somerset Creative Network, and this week our special guest is artist Charlie Tweed. So we have a few members of the audience in the room, and I shall be doing my best to switch between cameras in order to give you the best view of what is going on. And fingers crossed, technology behaves, because that is certainly the subject of this evening's presentation. So, Charlie.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, do you want to?
Brilliant. Yeah, so thanks very much for inviting me here. So I thought I'd just do a quick introduction to my practice, my work over the last few years. Then I'm going to show this film that's up here first, and then I'll say a little bit more about some of the films that have led up to it as my practice. So in my work, I'm going to create video, text, sound, and performance works mainly. And they've tended to interrogate human relations with machines and technologies, and their role in the control and management of populations and environment. And I'm particularly interested in the mechanisms of capitalism, how they operate on both human and non-human materials. So in past works, I've developed speculative approaches for subverting these mechanisms, rethinking technologies, and for redefining relationships with human and non-human. And in all of the works, I employ a kind of methods of speculative fiction to allow me to project ideas of how things might be in the future forms of machine, future forms of relationships with machine and ecology. And I also work with different voices, so I moved away from some of my earlier works where I worked with a single kind of alter ego character to working with a whole set of different voices and perspectives. I'm also interested in the kind of effective qualities of technologies. And how the manipulation of the image and sound can have physical and subconscious effects on the viewer, and actually how the videos themselves might perform on the viewer. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. The first film I just want to screen, and then I'll talk more about where this kind of film has come from and some of my previous work, is called Notes from the Subsurface. So this was a film from 2020. It was completed just before the pandemic really took off, and it was shown in the Wills Memorial Building in Bristol. And this was part of something called the Earth Art Fellowship. And this is a fellowship that I took part in for almost a year in the end at Bristol University in Earth Sciences and Life Sciences. So I worked with scientists Dr. Tom Williams and Dr. Heather Buss. And I was looking particularly at the idea of the subsurface, so the deep subsurface in the Earth's underneath the Earth, underneath where we are now, which goes a few meters down to thousands and thousands of meters down. And I was really thinking about different life forms that are very invisible to us, and the huge amount of life forms that live down there in these very pristine environments in the deep subsurface. And I work with scientists who are kind of specialists in these areas, so looking at microbial life like bacteria and archaea, and then developing a film in collaboration with the scientists that utilises science fictional strategies to think about human life in the future, and think about how it might end up in the deep subsurface as a kind of critical way of looking at humans. And I was particularly interested in these life forms that are known as extremophiles, that can survive in deep subsurface conditions without any oxygen, in kind of high radiation, high acidic conditions, with very little food sources. And this is something that you'll see the film talks about as we move down through the subsurface. And as we move further down, there's less and less kind of ways that any kind of life form can metabolize. And this is something that the film also talks about. And I was really interested in this project in using fiction as a method of collaboration, so between the artist and the scientist, and finding an in-between space to be able to do that. And for me, it was important that the kind of science and art research became a kind of assemblage of interactions rather than just the artist responding to the science or visualizing the science or something like this. So by the conversations that we had, I was able to find common ground that a scientist was interested in science fiction as well, as a method. And so we were able to project some kind of critical potential futures off the back of some of their scientific research. So the film you're about to see includes some of their research, so it includes fact about certain life forms in the deep subsurface, and it includes speculations which have an absurd quality to them about where human life could end up in the future, based on thinking about these life forms. So I think let's have a look at notes from the subsurface.
We begin at the British Shale, and remember that it was once below our feet, submerged within the oceans, 550 million years ago. When its soft-bodied organisms were moving, just like the sediments that now hold them. As we descend, we open up a space into subterranean life. We begin thinking of Earth magnitude and seeing in Earth time. We consider the human and think about how it can evolve as a subsurface life form with new functionality for the extreme conditions. The combined subsurface biospheres are around 2 million cubic kilometers in size, twice that of the world's oceans, with around 23 billion tons of microorganisms, many times the weight of every human. We begin to see that much of life is within the Earth, rather than on top of it. That the human is not the dominant species, that the human has much to learn about resilience. As we travel, we encounter the underground network of non-human intelligence, including connected roots who seek more just by listening. As well as various forms of fungus focused upon spore dispersal. Further down, we find the haunted remnants of abandoned coal mines and the excrement of shale extraction. From here, we reach the lithosphere and the pristine layerings, moving away from oxygen-rich materials such as clay. A mile or more below the surface, there is no sunlight and little oxygen. In these conditions, organisms have to make use of whatever energy source they can find. Some have been around for hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years, operating happily below the humans on the surface.
We are the nematode. No one expected that we could exist this far down, around 3 kilometers, located in an old gold mine. But perhaps they forget we are very hardy. We can cope with extreme heat, cold and dehydration, and low oxygen levels. Whilst humans need their air to contain 21% oxygen, we can work with 0.5%. When there are no nutrients around us, we can transform into a dour stage. It is triggered by a pheromone and occurs when there is a lack of food, high temperature, If only humans could be like us, we could keep them in stasis for hundreds of years, until we felt that it was okay to let them metabolize again.
Meanwhile, little is known about the CPR bacteria, a diverse group that live in the subsurface, and many other environments such as soils and the gut microbiomes of animals such as humans and dolphins. They have restricted metabolic capacities and cannot be grown by humans. There are many of them in the subsurface, vast colonies, but they remain anonymous.
We are the archaeans. We are a part of the archaea, the primary domain of life. We are very distantly related to other forms of life. We are single-celled and carry a large grappling hook on the surface, which allows us to grip onto each other and onto other things. It means that we are able to act as a collective whenever we choose.
We are the Methanogens. We are one of the first archaea. We live around 2.5 kilometers down. We've been alive for thousands of years, operating silently. We capture energy when electrons flow from hydrogen to carbon dioxide. We love carbon dioxide and release methane as a waste product. We are found in many places where oxygen is not present, including digestive tracts of animals and in swamp mud. We are very good at staying still, metabolically active but in near spaces. We offer potential for extended lives. Imagine an adaptive human that can survive at temperatures of 110 degrees and live 5 kilometers down, like the hyperthermophilic Methanogen. A human that needs no oxygen and loves ingesting CO2.
Whilst humans orientate towards rapid processes, diurnal cycles based on the sun, or lunar cycles based on the moon, these organisms are part of slow, persistent cycles operating on geological timescales. Throughout our journey, we see the nation of life forms as energy types disperse. The diversity of metabolisms is crucial in these ecosystems, using minuscule amounts of energy to live, as well as being highly adaptable to different carbon sources and electron acceptors. As we move down, oxygen levels deplete, carbon-based nutritional material fades into bedrock, and we encounter endoliths, life forms who metabolize by eating rocks and oxidizing them. At 5 kilometers and deeper, we encounter organisms that sporulate. Sporulation is the formation of nearly dormant forms of bacteria. Spores can preserve the genetic material when conditions are inhospitable for normal vegetative forms. This stasis is similar to humans in cryogenic suspension, with our bodies not metabolizing. These findings link to the study of exobiology, the field concerned with the origins and future of life in the universe. We consider that if life on Earth can be this alien, then what strangeness might await us on other planets and in other futures? Humans must become like these extremophiles. In order to survive, they must modify their functionality so that they can operate within geochemically extreme conditions that are detrimental to most life on Earth. Their journey begins in the vision space, a simulation environment with live data feeds. Participants begin to appreciate multiple forms of consciousness and metabolism, a recalibration of physiologies, vision, and cognition. Here, they can experience life as an Altairkian, 2.5 kilometers down, or as a magnetic bacteria, seeking out oxygen. They can experience swimming in highly acidic conditions, or operating within extreme heat and under extreme pressure. Participants do exercises where they try to simulate the actions of the Altairkian, using their battling hooks for collective action. Here, they develop their hyperempathy. Others think about living in rock fissures, attempting to slow down their metabolism. They experience how to trigger their power stage, living in near stasis. In the output space, we have developed a technology that is driving therapeutic co-creation between species, utilizing all of the research data to generate new resilient life forms. We are interested in the surplus values of code, extracting and sequencing DNA from samples to drive resilience. As a result, we are designing new life forms. Human, Albiarchian hybrids, human nematode hybrids, human pathogen hybrids. They are built upon self-modifying patterns, allowing them to adjust their functionality based upon changes in conditions. We are using bioprinting to activate them. Participants will harness their adaptive unconscious to take on their chosen life form. They will embed themselves in new subsurface ecosystems. They will become immersed in pristine layerings. While the surface waits for the next explosion.
Okay, so we're just going to swap inputs, aren't we? Yeah,
Fantastic. Great.
Yeah, so I suppose I should say that that was, yeah, so that film was made with the scientists and then it was shown in the Earth Art Gallery in the Wills Memorial Building, along with some other artefacts in display cases. So there was a mixture of kind of fictional artefacts, science fiction novels, theoretical books that had influenced the film, as well as displays by the scientists that I've worked with. And then we had an event where I made a presentation that was kind of a semi-fictional lecture, and the scientists presented their research. So it brought all this together in a really, I think, interesting and rich way. So it felt like it worked really well. So what I was actually going to do was kind of go through some of this fictional lecture now, actually, and I think that would be a nice way to unpack the film. So it's kind of a way of doing it which is less of a standard kind of artist talk and more of a kind of playful piece of work. And obviously, because I use fiction, it feels appropriate. And I will talk about a few older works of this. So yeah, so I'm going to run through this, and there's visuals that go with it. Okay. So this is actually called Notes on the Subsurface. So it kind of expands on that piece of work. I use these words to make myself into other species, machines, and objects. I becomes we becomes a sensor or a future specialist technology seeking out new directions, a translation mechanism, an anonymous power force, a collective of potentials, a hybrid entangled being. We want to unravel non-human perspectives and move away from a singular voice. We want to harness the functionality of algorithmic governmentality in order to take another path. Therefore, we have developed the Subsurface Laboratory, a vast space stretching 2,000 metres down. It can be accessed from just below your feet, via the old mine shafts and sinkholes, or by travelling through the network of 300-year-old tunnels, here below Bridgewater. It is a research site embedded within the earth and its layerings that stretches its tentacles out for many miles in every direction. It is situated amongst the remnants of dead plants and animals as they transform and decay, embedding themselves in the strata, a process that is often disturbed as they are reappropriated and siphoned into pipelines to power and enliven machines. Despite extreme heat, minuscule nutrition and intense pressure, we know that the subterranean biosphere is teeming with many tons of microorganisms, hundreds of times the combined weight of every human on the top of the earth. So our technologies and sensors are observing and monitoring their metabolisms and behaviour. The diversity of these underworld species bears comparison to the Amazon or the Galapagos Islands. But unlike these places, the environment is still largely pristine. Therefore, we feel it is a place of possibilities. It is also a good place for collaboration between scientists, artists, writers, non-humans, machines, fossils, and AI. It is a good place for collective thinking, and it is also a good place for discovering new patterns for living, and for seeking out generative joy and terror. Our technologies allow us to monitor and learn from the subsurface life forms, using our translation mechanisms and our fictional writing approach to listen. Our exploration machines build on the supercomputers that were used by humans to discover oil. They demand enormous computational power and enable massive data management. They are able to do 4,000 trillion calculations per second. In our work, we value improvisation and jump cuts and randomizer algorithms, encouraging participants to perform as other species, to relocate their consciousness. We are encouraging them to work together in order to design new futures. Many say that the human has little to be proud of these days, that the human impact on the earth is all about shooting itself in the foot, with its narrow vision of the planet and of other species, as it fracks them to pieces and emits its effluent. We feel that the social body is in paralysis, unable to come to terms with the calculation for the probabilities of their own future, the future that their data economy does not wish to see. Whilst the possibility of rethinking conditions deteriorates, the only decisions that they make become filtered through the technical apparatus. So while the surface burns, they view it through their screens and their hand gestures, their taps, their clicks, their swipes, their likes and pinched-in zooms. These become the response. As Stiegler tells us, these screens drive entropy in their users. They anticipate and outstrip their thought processes, their words, their decision-making. Meanwhile, they make plans for further extraction. So in the subsurface laboratory, we are focused on bringing a new visibility, opening up perspectives by turning our vision towards the ground, towards the pristine layerings that lie beneath our feet. We want to bring the subsurface life forms and their ecosystems into view and understand non-human temporalities and functionalities. So we turn our ears towards them and begin listening. We like the sound of entanglements and complex meshes. We record what we hear with these words. Our approach connects with Donna Haraway, who calls for the use of fiction to develop multi-species perspectives, using stories that are just big enough to gather up the complexities and keep the edges open. So following Haraway, we want to make kin with rocks, fossils, machines, archaea, methanogens, nematodes, CPR bacteria, and rethink ourselves as a species, as a new type of collaborator. In the writing of Ursula Le Guin and Octavia E. Butler, forms of fictional social experiment are used in order to outline models which rethink our engagement with other living worlds, both interplanetary and terrestrial. Le Guin outlines the notion of dispossession as a change of mentality in which statelessness and being without property is the precondition for genuine freedom. In Parable of the Sower, Butler proposes a politics of hyperempathy, a notion of interplanetary cooperation and guesting. Meanwhile, Simon O'Sullivan notes that fiction can be used as a matter of make-believe, but rather in a Rontier's sense of forging the real, not as a matter of make-believe, but rather in a Rontier's sense of forging the real to better approximate historical and contemporary experience. So in our work, we harness fictioning to develop our proposals for future relations between the human, the non-human, the ecological, and the machine, using it as a tool and a weapon that infiltrates and actively pursues alternatives. We explore the functionality of long extinct fossils, building them into our plans. We are thinking about how temporality is spatially embedded in sedimentations and condensations, which have the potential to form a kind of object that operates as what Deleuze would call a radioactive fossil. Objects that through our chain, charge and materiality make transversal cuts through time. Such objects can act as portals to collapse temporal moments together. Thus we consider the Burgess shale life forms and connect them with our present and our future. So when we see a rock, we don't see stasis, but movement, temporalities that flow over centuries and millennia. And when we look around at humans and non-humans, we cannot distinguish them. We see the tangled web of relations, complex meshes and trees of life. Timothy Morton calls for humans to become more aware of their entanglement with other species. And he defines the notion of the hyperobject, an object so vast and distributed that it is beyond human vision. The subsurface and its vast scale and set of ecosystems could also be labelled as a form of vast hyperobject. And in Morton's terms, the words on this paper are contingent on a complex mesh that of course includes dependency on trees and also on sunlight. We are feeding our research data into a vast set of neural networks to produce designs for hybrid future life forms, capable of living within the deep subsurface. For us, it makes sense to position the future of the human species in the hands of AI technology. Feed them to their machines, we say. Our strategy for future human life functions as a form of montage of different life forms, research and data, an assemblage of quotes and ideas. We see value in reappropriation and reassemblage. This approach drives our hyperempathy, enables new imaginative models for more than human comradeship across coexisting scales of time and space. We also build here on discussions around genetically modifying life forms for extraterrestrial exploration on planets such as Mars. We connect with Guattari in the three ecologies, where he calls for the creation of new experimental living species by a constantly mutating socius, an environment in the process of being reinvented. Species with self-regenerating circuitry that are future-proofed, reformatting and escaping the limitations of human code. Life forms that harness the functionality of the Altiarchaeas, the methanogens, the nematodes, the CPR bacteria, the magnetic bacteria, capable of living under extreme pressure, in high temperatures and toxic conditions, life forms that enjoy highly acidic, high radiation, low oxygen, and methane-heavy environments, life forms capable of living with minimal nutrition and very slow metabolism, life forms capable of feeding happily on rocks or carbon, or lying dormant for vast timescales over centuries and millennia. For us, the future can take only one direction. The only way is down. The only way is down. The only way is down. So that's the lecture that was given alongside with the scientists. We then made a book, so it's more of a publication that kind of accompanies it, and it has a lecture in it, and it has an interview that I did with Tom Williams, who I worked with on the project. And I think that drew out some really kind of interesting parallels of things that he drew on from what we ended up with in terms of the film and the collaboration. So yeah, I'll pass those back. But I wanted to kind of move just back a bit now to give you a sense of how I arrived at this sort of work that I'm making now. So let's go back then, back to 2008. So back in those days, I was working actually using performance and making films of myself as a character in different places, doing particular proposals for particular places, sites, communities, all of these kind of things. So what you see there on the screen is a performance at the Paul Klee Museum in Switzerland as a character called the Man from Below, and it was for something that was called Drag Down into Lowercase. So it was a kind of exhibition that was outdoors, excavated outside the museum into the ground with various artists, and so I responded to that site with my character and made a plan for Bern's citizens to move underground. And I was actually addressing a number of kind of issues that were kind of in the surrounding area about moving certain communities underground. And this kind of work was the initial work that I made, and it resulted in quite a few video works of the character, making these kind of subversive proposals, giving live lectures, and lots of different spaces. These happened in spaces just outside London, spaces in Cumbria, and so on. But there was only so far I could get with this slightly absurd character, and so I began to think about other ways of making films and performing, and so I kind of started to develop other voices and work with fiction to think about anonymous collectives voicing different sorts of videos, different characters, taking more of the role of an author as an artist. So here is something that I created then for Spike Island back in 2010, called Notes 1, 2 and 3. And this exhibition consisted of 8 short propaganda films which addressed different human control desires and belief systems. And the kind of works acted as calls to action from kind of anonymous voices and collectives with slightly absurd proposals that had a kind of resonance to them, and they were designed to kind of perform on the audience who were watching them. And each of the videos that you see here were projected onto different walls. The audience had nowhere to sit, they were just thrown all these different kind of ideas that partly made sense and partly didn't. Ideas around technical singularity, rewilding, mass flooding, all sorts of ideas that drew them in and pushed them back at the same time. So I kind of figured out this way of making videos that perform on the viewer and make use of a lot of appropriated material to reformat it into these new forms. So a lot of the material that the videos are made from comes from archives, from YouTube, from all sorts of different sources. And alongside that exhibition, I made a fictional manifesto, which came from these fictional voices behind the film. So there's this added layer of the project. And that felt like quite an interesting work, and a lot of that manifesto was actually constructed from appropriated text. So I began to use appropriated text quite heavily in the work. And really just wanted to talk about that very briefly. So that kind of idea of using appropriated footage and appropriated text and reconstituting it, kind of remixing it, that kind of use of bricolage, became quite a key thing in the work, and really thinking about kind of all the content of digital culture and actually not going to shoot things, but actually using that content and repackaging it in more critical works, playing it back on itself. And this is just an example of something that kind of uses that kind of strategy. So it's called Reality Hunger, a Manifesto by David Shields, and actually it's a book that appears to be a kind of novel, but actually it's made up almost completely of appropriated text that has been constructed into the work. And this is something that kind of resonates with the strategy I used in my work. And this particularly kind of then informs a video that I made after those notes series at Spike Island. So this is something called Archimeters that I made in 2012. And this actually is mainly made up, of course, of appropriated footage, because that's something I was doing already, but also appropriated text, so taken from software testing handbooks that I edited together in different ways to come up with a script for this particular film. And the film actually uses a lot of footage of a place in China called Ordos. And I was really interested in Ordos because it was basically a near-empty ghost camp in Inner Mongolia at the time. It was kind of newly built but remained almost completely empty, so it was this eerie kind of place. And the film turns it into something else, a kind of effective machine, and appropriates all of its kind of tourist footage and uses the script from testing handbooks to turn it into this machine. So that was Archimedes. We might have a look at it later. I also made a number of films that were kind of site-specific about other places. So this is one called Grain that was made at the same time almost. And this was a performance and also a film. And so Grain looked at the Isle of Grain in Kent and thought about a few kind of key parts, components of it. So the Isle of Grain is often kind of a slightly forgotten about space used as a storage container port. used as the kind of place where the Britain power cable from Europe arrives. There's power stations on it. There's some humans, but not a huge population. And there's 300,000 birds. So I was quite interested in the bird population as being the main kind of key population on the island. And it was interesting at that point then, because the island itself was proposed as the potential place where they would build the third runway of Heathrow instead of at Heathrow. So, and I think it was Boris Johnson who proposed that actually. They were going to build a platform into the sea and kind of wipe out all of this huge bird population on the island. So actually the film itself makes this plan that's almost from the perspective of the birds about the future of the island. So it's from the perspective of the non-human inhabitants of it. So that was great. I'll just talk through a couple of other examples. So here's something else. So this is, I suppose, this kind of connects with Notes on the Subsurface, because this is one of the kind of first bigger projects I worked on with a scientist, where I collaborated with scientists. So this was between 2014 and 2017. And so I worked with Animate Projects in London on something called Silent Signal. So there were six scientist artist collaborations. And I was one of them. And I worked with Darren Logan, Dr. Darren Logan from the Genome Campus, where he worked at the time, Welcome to Us Genome Campus. So he was essentially looking at sequencing genetics, and particularly genetically influenced behaviour via smell, actually. So the idea of this project was to formulate some form of collaboration that resulted in a film work. So I began this process with him, and again, there was kind of shared interest here in kind of science fiction as a method for projecting what he was doing at the Welcome Campus into the future, and that's kind of what we ended up looking at in the end. So on the campus, they are sequencing genomes of animals and humans, actually, all non-stop all day. And at the time, it was still quite expensive to actually sequence your personal genome, get all of your DNA data. And actually what you see in front of you there is a bookcase with one individual's DNA, sequenced DNA inside it. So that's how much data it is if you printed it out. Okay. So it's a lot of code. And obviously, a key thing that all the scientists were doing, they were trying to understand this, and they're still obviously trying to understand this now. It's lots and lots of data that no one can understand at this point. But in more recent times, it should be said that you can now get your genome sequenced quite cheaply in comparison. So for 500 to 800 pounds, you can get it, so it's downloaded onto your iPad, for example, or your smartphone. So you could be carrying your genome data around and get your code fixed eventually. Okay, so that's what I was playing with here. So I was thinking about the parallels between what they were doing, the terms they were using, because they used terms like CRISPR as a term in genetic science, and CRISPR is about gene editing, the ability to change genes, which is a little bit like changing code to fix a piece of code on a website or on a piece of software or on an algorithm. So I was interested in those parallels. And that's what we began to talk about. So I devised a film that looked at a kind of those technological comparisons. And it looked towards humans and animals and thought about ways of fixing their code using a very much kind of technology computer language. And that's how the project progressed. And the project had kind of an intention of, one, showing some of his scientific research, and two, making this speculative proposal for a future sort of machine that wants to fix all of human code. And that's really where I started to work a lot with scientists on quite a few projects. And that project kind of materialised as a series of exhibitions, and alongside the other 5 films from the other science artist collaborations, as well as kind of educational materials. So I felt it was quite a successful project actually, and the educational materials built around it allowed lots of different people to engage with the science in different ways, in more accessible ways. Okay, so that was that project, and then I think I'll just show you one more project, just to give you a sense of something else, which is along, I suppose, some similar lines, but looks at a slightly different angle. Okay, so this is a project that thinks about technology, and this one began thinking about the smartphone, actually. So this is a project that began thinking about what I'm calling the hyper-object of a smartphone, or the realities of where all the elements of a smartphone come from. So that's its materials, its relation to labour, its impacts on communities, on animals, on the environment, of course, and actually kind of pointing towards a kind of new technological colonialism which sources raw materials in different countries all over the world. Places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a number of key components for technologies like coltan have been sourced in the past. So that's where I began with this kind of research, kind of mapping process. But this then became other works. Okay, so this then became works that brought in some kind of fictional, speculative elements for thinking about this in different ways. So the map traced the origins of the smartphone, and it included things like the TV advert for this particular smartphone that I got off YouTube. So it had all of the different layers of its elements. And then that kind of forged into a lecture, kind of performative lecture, which went through some of this network of components from the smartphone as a kind of political act in the practice. And I took on a fictional role of the researchers who were attempting to embody all of these complex relations, thinking about the mountain gorillas who were impacted by the extraction of particular raw materials, thinking about kind of different temporalities of the raw materials and the earth and its relationship to the smartphone. And the lecture kind of developed further into making some proposals for how things might follow different pathways here. And you can see that the lecture took place in different places, and this is actually the lecture when it took place in Beijing at the Chinese Central Academy of Fine Arts, and there I kind of gave it to some Chinese students who and we were really talking about the kind of vast e-waste sites in China where a lot of smartphone elements end up. And actually these students just really didn't know about some of these places like Wuyu where they do end up, so it's quite an interesting process. So from there, I used some of those fictional strategies to think about a way of talking about the kind of e-waste sites where technologies end up, how some of them get recycled, how other elements get burned and melted and end up in the ground, the earth, all of these kind of things. So I kind of constructed a map and a mechanism for voicing some of these non-human elements. So what you see there actually is a kind of map that's constructed that thinks about these different characters, and some of these characters were life forms, and some of these were just kind of disposed materials, some of these were raw materials, all sorts of different things. Thinking about them as an audio transmission. So this actually became a sound work and an audio installation. So you can see it here actually. So here it is in the Stanley Picker Gallery, and it's an audio installation with speech and sounds and all sorts of different pieces. So it's quite a long piece of work, about 48 minutes long. And what you see visually is something called a spectrogram. So it's which is basically a visualization of the sound we're hearing. And it looks like a kind of strata, a kind of diagram of rock, actually. So it kind of works in quite an interesting way. And inside this work, in a kind of way that you will have noticed in some of the other works, towards the end there's a proposal for a future kind of sustenance of these machines by harnessing different types of technology that might be more sustainable in the future, might work in more kind of ecological friendly ways and all of these kind of things. So that's kind of where that ended up. But alongside that, and of course I've missed a key thing, is that a kind of key angle of this project was that all of these voices were kind of ghost-like voices. So they're kind of post-human ghosts, the traces of human culture and technology that have been buried deep in the ground. So they're obsolete, they're decaying, they're all kind of operating over different temporalities, so they slowly kind of rot away or decay in the earth. And this kind of measured interrelation is expressed. And alongside it, there was a publication which is called The Signal in the Rock, and this publication kind of delves into what's happening in the sound piece in much more detail, in quite a playful way. So it has kind of transcripts with lots of notes and extended kind of elements of kind of assembled materials. And so this itself became a kind of layered fictional hyper-object, kind of transmission in text form. And you can see just some of the elements there. But yeah, but hopefully, I'm going to stop there because I think that's quite a lot, so hopefully that gives you a sense of some of my previous work and where that film came from that I showed you just now.
Yeah, thank you. My mind is gone. And I've got loads of questions, but I don't want to be the only voice, so does anyone need piling? I have got an absolute warm burning question.
Yeah.
If no one's quite ready with theirs yet, and I'm quite ready with this. And so I suppose it's the nature of, I tend to think about kind of traditional storytelling, and when I first watched Notes on the Surface, one of the first references that popped straight into my head, of course, is H.G. Wells and the characters that live kind of underground in Time Machine. And that a lot of science fiction can be quite dystopian. And I wonder, and kind of maybe wonder about the reaction of the scientists, where you've got that blend of fact, but also that opportunity to, envisage the future in that sort of with the power of imagination as well.
Yeah.
And I wondered about, did it tend towards the dystopian, or were the kind of utopian visions as well? Because often I read a lot where it sort of talks about the fact that, when we talk about the future, it is dystopian. We tend not to actually talk about the positive aspects and to look to that. Is that something that they were conscious of and you have been conscious of? Or?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think the scientists, I suppose the parallels are that they're used to actually using some creativity to develop a hypothesis about something. So that is the thing. Mm. So there's a bit of a parallel there, and of course there's a play on some dystopian ideas there, but then not all dystopian. So trying actually to move away, but I think some of the early films were very dystopian actually. The Notes one that I showed you, Spy Park, that I mentioned earlier on. But yeah, this was trying to be, critical of humans.
Yes.
But not of anything else. So I think that was something that is a kind of reality, thinking about the different ideas of time between humans and lots of other life forms. Because some of those bacteria have been around for 20,000 years. They think.
Yeah, well, what was interesting about that piece was, because I didn't feel anything dystopian from that work at all. And actually, it was more the interesting thing of, the sort of repositioning of ourselves. A bit like when they changed the maps. There was a point at which they changed the maps, wasn't there? And because some countries were portrayed as being much bigger than other countries, they sort of they created it as it kind of should be, and gave, obviously that sort of then gave status to other countries because of their size or whatever. But that sense of the geological age and how much time we've kind of been around for, and that this notion that of climate change as opposed to climate emergency, and that but that change has, you know, over the grand scheme of things, has been constant. You know, we tend to think of it as, well, because we are making some of it happen, and so we've sped it up in a sense, haven't we?
Yeah.
But also that thing of where we sit as a species amongst other species.
Yeah.
And yeah, just that reposition
Absolutely.
of where
and I think
are.
we operate in a very human-centric way, don't we,
Yes,
as a species,
yeah.
and we don't look at our feet, and we don't think in other how other species might see things, or the timescales of the Earth in different ways, and all of these kind of things. And actually, there's that idea of the anthropocene, which we can see is deeply a real thing in terms of human action on the Earth and how that's taking place. But there's other definitions of that which are interesting about, looking at it from different perspectives and animal perspectives and material perspectives. But yeah, I think that's a key intention there, is to get humans to think about the other things living around them, including the bacteria inside in our guts, and there's other species living within us right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was sort of interested in your collaboration with working with the scientists and sort of, I mean, do they read a lot of science fiction?
Well, actually, Tom seems to watch quite a lot of science fiction. Actually.
Yeah.
So it's not everyone. No.
It is sort of weird. I was recommended a book and the Black Cloud or the Black by he's a scientist who's written a science fiction book, and it's based. I mean, he wrote it, I think, in the 50s.
Yeah.
But the way it's written is very matter of fact. It's how you imagine the style of writing, although it's about scientists basically saving the Earth from a planet that's in the wrong, which has a consciousness actually.
Okay.
The planet has a consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's all very, so that was sort of, I don't know, it just seems sort of really amusing to a scientist writing about science fiction, dealing with very logical investigations.
No, totally.
Yeah.
And actually, I suppose the interesting thing, which is in both of the science collaboration works that I made, is that a lot of people think it's all fiction, like all of it, and so it's kind of a play on a lot of it is most of it's real, apart from some fictional proposals towards the end.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I was thinking was about, because it was also about earth sciences that you were sort of dealing with, and so much recently sort of artists' work is based very much around interactions with AI or with machines, with that sort of. So this seemed a much more organic, natural sort of work than it's sort of so popular. I don't know, work with sort of maybe with younger artists. I don't know, although there's also massive environmental sort of.
I mean, you're right. There's a lot of people working with VR and AI actually, and things like that. So it's not something that's really been so of interest to me. Because I'm trying to do something that talks about that technology, maybe in a critical way. But I suppose I've got two angles really, where I think about technology in a critical way, but I also am really interested in kind of the non-human, and so I do kind of, and sometimes that joins up, and sometimes it doesn't.
But also, is there a tension for you as an artist whereby you're being critical of the technology, but you're also utilising the technology, though not at the kind of the AI front or the VR front?
I think it's important to be critical of technology as a practitioner for sure, because I think it's easy to get lost in something like VR or immersive, and then I've seen a lot of not very interesting immersive things. So when I come from years ago doing an MA in electronic media, which was kind of the early days of some of that online art and CD-ROM art and all of that. So I've been looking at this stuff quite a long time actually. So I'm quite critical of it, but I think you can use technologies, of course, in interesting ways. But I use it, but I'm critical of it. One reason for using the appropriated material is I'm interested in the non-HD image and the potential of that actually, because everything is more and more HD that we see in front of us, and it's all very effective and enticing. But what about those kind of images that have depleted data and we can kind of, they're more malleable, they're almost like working with 16mm or 8mm film or something. And that's actually the early films. I used to refilm off the screen and use all sorts of tactics to give them a kind of way that it was quite difficult to tell what the source was. Were they actually
and how old they were?
Yeah, were they off YouTube? You know, where was this stuff? And zoom in, and so it's quite pixelated. You know, so I think there's lots of potential with those kind of approaches. So I'm a bit like kind of fighting, you know, doing the opposite of the high definition a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And it gives it a sort of authority as well as sort of partly because it's archival stuff, so it's sort of, and there's a bit of a thing, isn't there, about, you know, losing the analogue. And not being able to access that in the future, because it's very sort of Doctor Who. So that you know what I mean, that sort of view.
Definitely, and you know, and actually working with that kind of source material can sometimes open, you know, kind of interesting doors in your work or creative ideas that you might not have had if you just worked in a more standard way.
And do you ever, in terms of using that kind of material, is there other considerations for you in terms of copyright and things like that? Is that something that you're conscious of?
No, of course.
When you're making? And so what do you do? Do you credit the sources, or do you?
I mean, it depends where it comes from. So some of the films you've seen there from, you know, online art. So that Notes and Subsurface, some of that was from ones that were actually paid for.
Yeah, like stock footage kind of
science art. So a mixture, actually.
Well, there was an interesting film that Greta Thunberg did where they chose deliberately not to go and shoot any new material, but to use what was already in existence. You know, that kind of conscious decision not to travel and, you know, and go and film Borneo or whatever, but to actually use what was already there.
Already out there. And I think there's some good arguments for that, depending on what the project is, what your intentions are, what you need it for.
But also, what was really interesting was how you presented the work. That this wasn't, I said, just been a film in an exhibition, as it were, but actually you've brought those other things to it, which has been about. So people aren't just engaging with it and they go off into their lives, but they're kind of contributing back and taking the work on through, you know, sort of creating stories with the scientists or inviting them to create it. That was really interesting.
And I quite like building those layers, and so that the lecture that came out of that was interesting. It's influenced other things I'm working on now. Beginning with text, and then the text, some of it's almost like short stories, some of it's appropriated material, but it almost forms a kind of book, but also film, small films, and other elements, even maybe sculptural elements. So it's kind of, but it starts there with this kind of set of texts.
What was the audience for the lecture that you gave in the Wheels building? Because that's a very sort of, you know, grandiose. Sort of
it was interesting because obviously the audience was some of the researchers there, and then quite a mixture of, you know, Bristol art, kind of people that were interested in art in Bristol, I guess. So it was a real kind of mix of kind of science. People interested in science.
You probably haven't been necessarily exposed to performance lecture.
No. And actually kind of the way we did it so that we all did it together, and they had some fictional kind of references at least in theirs. It was quite, it felt like it worked. I mean, it was a bit of an experiment. You know, but it felt like it, I felt like it was a rich kind of way of talking about all the work. And then we walked out into the art gallery, and it had in the showcases you know, one's made by the scientists, and then one's made by me, and so on. So it's no, I quite like that idea. I mean, that other science film that I mentioned, The Signal and the Noise, I also kind of showed that in a science museum up in Dundee, and as part of that project, and we got to kind of work with the collection that they had there. So I kind of made a fictional set of references out to some of their collection related to the novel. So that was really interesting, you know, and felt like a really kind of interesting way of developing that fiction into a real scientific museum.
And I just want to touch on something we talked about earlier, which is that thing of the use of an algorithm.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, you reference it in your work, but it's not, is it something that you have used to create? So the film that where eventually it becomes a machine. Have you used an algorithm yet in creating something?
Not in these, well, not really. You know, obviously you're using software that uses algorithms with effects, and so lots of effects and things like that, and especially the sound and the voices. But yeah, I've used the characters of algorithms, I would say, and machines in films that I've not shown today, that talked about today. But yeah, so I've kind of taken on the persona of algorithms doing a certain thing to a particular site or something like this. Algorithms that have maybe gone astray. So quite a lot of the characters are machines of sorts, future machines, and they often have strange kind of voices that are a little vocoded.
I think you showed on that Spark Studios one. Like machine, little things. That's what I saw.
Yeah.
Quite disturbing.
Yeah.
I can't remember it very well, but it was quite disturbing.
Yeah, there's I didn't talk about them today, but yeah, so there's a project called Fiction Machines that I've kind of made various films for, and they're all like machines that are kind of algorithms gone astray. They're quite subversive. One of them is like extracting information recovery, you know, taking that information recovery kind of idea, data recovery idea, but applying it to all sorts of things, physical as well, you know, applying it to a river and a lake and a forest, and you know, and it's kind of takes it to extremes as a way of kind of subverting itself.
It was interesting when you were talking about appropriation too, because I was thinking about it. Ultimately, that is, you know, when we're programming computers and things, it's appropriating data, isn't it, all the time? So I don't know. There's just something about that idea that that even when you get, you know, they're getting robots to create works of art, aren't they? They're all appropriating. They're appropriating data, aren't they?
Yeah.
Maybe have we done that as humans, or is there something other than that? Because just thinking about, you know, we take good influences, don't we?
But yeah, I mean, you're almost touching on kind of, you know, like AI now, that, you know, there's AI video editing tools on that do the edit for you, or make a film, or make a music video for you. There's, you know, I think I've looked at some of those. Some of them are not great, some of them are not that bad, actually. Disturbingly. And then there's the kind of text-to-image tools, which were really kind of not great at first, and now there's things like DALL-E, it's called, and you can type in stuff and it makes you an image that's pretty believable, actually. So yeah, if you have a look at DALL-E and see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Should we stop there?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's good. That's great. Thank you so much. That's been fascinating. And what we'll do is we'll share the links to your other work, if that's okay as well. So people can see some of the other films that you referenced.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Some of the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, let me know if it's behind a password or something. But I think
no,
most of
just
it is
no,
not. I think there's some that aren't.
Yes, yeah. Well, before we go, actually, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working towards now and what you might be?
I think I'll tell you about one thing, because I've got this other project that's it's in process. But I should say that I'm working on this kind of research project with the scientist Dr. Tom Williams is kind of part of it. So and I'm working with a composer from the Royal Welsh College of Music, and we're just developing I think we've done one workshop so far. It's called hyperempathy machines. So we're looking at scientific research on fungi and microbial life, so bacteria, etc., but also fungi. So we had 2 scientists in the room for our workshop, one from Cardiff University and then Tom from Bristol. And then we had artists in the room as well, and so they responded to the research on these particular life forms and fungi by constructing experimental ideas for machines that might be influenced by them or empathise with them, etc. So again, breaking out of those kind of standard algorithms, machines that we use that are very much about data extraction and things like that. So yeah, hyperempathy machines. And actually that was the start of a kind of creative experiment that we're carrying on, actually.
Is that the Versus Studio? That's not that.
We're not doing it now, actually, but yeah, I mean, we actually did it at Bart's Bar with some kind of initial seed funding.
Okay, alright.
But we're carrying on with that and growing that project. So yeah, it's really, so the first iteration was really interesting.
Yeah.
So we're now thinking about it from a sound perspective, and then maybe working with some sound students as well as maybe some art, kind of fine art students as well.
Yeah.
Oh, it's really inspiring, especially because when I think about, some of the partners that we work with, like Mendipeo and B, and, they're really wanting people to explore the geology of Somerset.
Yeah.
And that idea that you can add another layer, and what will we leave behind? What will our layer be in that sort of strata?
Yeah.
But also, can we unpack stories from other stratas to get into that subject as well? That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Thank you for that.
Okay. No, thank you.
So, I'm just going to pop this up.